The largest portion of the brain is the cerebrum. The smaller region behind here, this is the cerebellum. And then you have the medulla. So those are the three main portions of the brain. So the cerebrum is responsible for a lot of your higher level thinking. It's divided into four lobes. You have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe here in the back, and then on both sides you have the temporal lobe. Separating the cerebral hemispheres, you have this long deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. Basically it just separates both hemispheres from each other. So the function of the frontal lobe is a lot of your abstract thinking, reasoning, personality located here. It's kind of what makes you you. The parietal lobe has a lot of your long-term stored memory. Also, it's the site of the postcentral gyrus, or the fold right behind the central sulcus. That's where a lot of your sensory information, the primary somatosensory cortex, is located here. So information that's coming in from the body is being relayed to somewhere in this reach here, and that information, that sensory information, is being interpreted. And then juxtaposed to that here on the precentral gyrus here, that's the motor cortex. And basically information that's being interpreted in that sensory cortex, information is being sent back to that region of the body by the motor cortex. Okay, so that's separated by this thin, shallow groove called the central sulcus here. Sulcus means shallow depression. The occipital lobe is the primary visual cortex. A lot of your visual information is processed here, and that visual information is sent here. So the optic nerve comes from the back of the eye. The optic nerve innervates here at what's called the optic chiasm, and then that information is sent back here to the opposite occipital lobe. So if it's coming from the left eye, generally that information is being interpreted in the right occipital lobe, and then vice versa. This is the temporal lobe. A lot of your auditory centers is here. Wernicke's area, like language interpretation, is located here. Broca's area, I forgot to mention, is up here in the frontal lobe. It's responsible for a lot of your speech. Okay, so it's possible that if you had, say, a damaged Wernicke's area, that you could speak completely fine, but not really know what you're saying. Or if, let's say, Broca's area was damaged, but Wernicke's area was not, you'd be able to understand anything that was said, but you wouldn't be able to actually speak it or form coherent sentences. Okay, another one of the important cranial nerves on the underside or ventral side of the brain here is the olfactory bulb, which interprets the sense of smell. Oh, I forgot to mention some of the grooves here. So we have the longitudinal fissure, this deep groove here between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. This is the transverse fissure. You have the parieto-occipital fissure, which really isn't a very deep depression at all, but that's here. You have the lateral fissure, which separates the frontal and temporal lobes, which the temporal lobe is not very pronounced here on a sheep. It's a lot more pronounced on a human. You have the ventral fissure, which is located on this underside of the brain, this deep groove right here. Okay, let's look at the cerebellum, or the little brain. It's composed of white matter, just like the cerebrum is, and gray matter, same in the cerebrum. The white matter is deeper to the more superficial gray matter. The primary function of white matter is quick relay. They're made of myelinated neurons. It's fast relay. The gray matter is more of your learned memory stored here. So if we did a transverse cut here or something and we looked at the inside of the cerebrum, we would also see that deeper is white, outer layer of the cerebral cortex is gray. So white, it's all about speed, gray is more for storage. Okay, some of the important internal structures. This upper portion, there's a dense mass of tissue located right here it's been severed. That's the corpus callosum. What it does, it allows communication between the cerebral hemispheres. So if that's severed, it's almost like both sides of the brain function independently of one another. So inside of the corpus callosum here, you can see that it extends laterally into each hemisphere. That's the lateral ventricle. So there's two of them, one on each side. And it's separated by a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum. You can see portions of it here. Much of it's been cut off during the dissection process, and so you can almost think of that like the first and second ventricle, because then right here above the thalamus is the third ventricle, and that fluid travels down, the cerebrospinal fluid travels down cerebral aqueduct right here. It's a channel that leads to the last ventricle, which is the fourth ventricle, which extends up into the cerebellum. This continues on down through the spinal cord, and the whole purpose of this is to circulate cerebrospinal fluid, basically allow the internal portions of the central nervous system to get the nutrients they need. You know, the sodium, the potassium, the calcium that's necessary for action potential to occur. Okay, so then we have the fornix. Basically connects the internal structures of the brain, both hemispheres. Also the thalamus, which is like the switchboard operator. That information is, sensory information is relayed to the thalamus, where it's directed to the correct portions of the brain. This little structure below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. I think the hypothalamus, H for homeostasis, regulation of, you know, body temperature, hunger, things like that. This is the pineal gland, or the pineal body. It's responsible for the production of melatonin, which regulates sleep patterns. You've got the pons, which helps interpret sensory information directed to the thalamus. Let's see. Most of what you're going to need to know for the quiz.